Dr. Zaretsky didn't remember falling. She'd hit her head on impact with the ground, hard enough to knock the immediate memory out of her brain, but not quite hard enough to remember everything else. The feeling of mushy fungal fingers wrapping around her waist, of rising rapidly into the air, the haze of deadly spores so thick in the air that they'd created a layer coating her hazmat suit. 5 meters. That's how far she'd fallen. About half the height of an Olympic diving board. Only there wasn't a pool at the bottom, and she'd landed badly. Dr. Zaretsky had been lying in her hospital bed for nearly a month. It was rare to have an encounter with a 30-meter-tall SCP go south and still live to tell the tale. She knew that as well as anyone, seeing colleagues dying in all kinds of ways around her for years. But try as she might, through all the broken bones, all the bruises and scars, and all the indignity that being bedridden in a hospital brought, she couldn't help but just feel sad. Were all these SCPs monsters? And what was happening to 5771 as she lay there, broken? It will be no surprise to many that the SCP Foundation monitors emergency service calls. Often, if there is a deadly creature on the loose, the first people to hear about it are emergency service operators. Whether they believe it is another case, something that benefits the Foundation greatly much of the time. That was how SCP-5771 was discovered. Bryce Wheeler, a junior agent not yet ready for fieldwork, was monitoring incoming 911 calls in California when a call pricked her interest. It wasn't so much the content of the call itself. It was in fact that there was a third call that morning where someone had died on the phone. As soon as the line connected, all that could be heard was wheezing and choking noises. The operator tried their best to reassure the person that help was on its way and that they were tracking the location of the call, but it seemed to provide little comfort. The choking noises stopped, and there was the familiar static thud of the phone and body falling to the ground. Then the line just sat open, totally silent. It made sense why the line was silent, as Agent Wheeler looked at the tracking data on where that call was coming from. It was a national park, the middle of nowhere. Chances were there wouldn't be any emergency services on the scene for a good hour at least. That gave the Foundation time to swing into action, diverting any emergency services in the area to other calls and creating sufficient confusion within the emergency services to file a couple of false response IDs so nobody would ever notice. That kind of thing was and is very standard procedure for the Foundation at this point. Since Wheeler had caught the call, she was given permission to ride along as they went to investigate. She only had one piece of intel to pass on to the senior agents as their SUV bumped its way through the national park. A choked word that all 3 callers had said, mushroom. They stopped about a kilometer out from where the call had come in from and got out of the car to see their first body of the day. There would be plenty more before the sun would go down that night. It was a hiker, early 20s, in good shape. They'd evidently collapsed on the trail. Lying face down, there was a small, drying pool of saliva in the dirt. Must have been coughing, too. Agent Wheeler was just about to go over to the body and roll it onto its back when one of the other agents put a hand on her shoulder. This was potentially a biohazard situation. They could not risk getting infected. They would proceed in the vehicle with caution. They passed 3 more bodies on the trail as they went. They reported each one back to the Foundation, who were in the process of setting up a perimeter around the national park and combing the outskirts looking for hikers for apprehension and medical help. Once they'd passed their 5th body, the driver stopped the car again. He was leaning forwards in his seat, peering up into the sky. Agent Wheeler tried her best to see what he and all the others were looking up at, but couldn't make it out. They were next to a little rocky canyon with a few trees sticking up out of the ground, most of them stripped nearly white by the heat of the sun. Actually, there was one tree that looked taller than the others, thinner too. As she leaned forward in the seat and her eyes saw more and more of the tree, she quickly realized it wasn't a tree at all. It was a pair of spindly legs, then a skeletal torso with gangly arms, then an elongated neck, and then a mushroom. Without thinking, Agent Wheeler opened the SUV's door and stepped out into the California heat. She was tiny in comparison to the creature before her, barely as tall as its ankle. Its whole body seemed to be soft and slightly wrinkled, just like the mushrooms you'd cook with at home. Her mouth fell wide open as she stared up at it, and to her surprise, it turned around and stared back. It didn't have eyes, a face, or any features at all. All there was a giant mushroom for a head, but somehow it seemed to see her. It leaned down and peered closely at her. The agents in the car were yelling something behind her, but she ignored them. There was something ancient about this creature, and yet something so young and innocent. She coughed, then coughed again. Tiny spores were floating through the air all around her. Within 3 minutes, Agent Wheeler's throat had totally closed off, full of fungal growths. The other agents tried to open fire on the creature, but were all dead just moments after she was, all choked to death. All told, the Foundation discovered 18 civilian bodies that day. Each was reported to their family as having died of other causes. No autopsies were allowed to be carried out. Anyone who claimed to have seen any kinds of mushrooms when interrogated that day were administered Class A amnestics. The containment perimeter quickly tightened as Foundation personnel moved in on this enormous mushroom man. With heavy weaponry at the ready, the Foundation surrounded the creature. It bent down on its approach with hands out by its sides. This was interpreted as an act of hostility, and the SCP was secured swiftly and without leniency. A special containment cell had to be constructed for the Mushroom Man, as it was far too tall for any standard cell. It was detained in an external holding area until the 32-meter-tall cell had completed construction. Once inside, the Foundation was able to get to work studying it. Designated SCP-5771, this SCP measures 30.48 meters in height. Its organic tissue seems to be made up entirely of a gargantuan fungal growth. The head of the creature resembles a mushroom of the Amanita pantherina species, also known as the panther cap mushroom. The body resembles a rudimentary humanoid skeleton. Samples taken from it have revealed that it is composed of the mushroom's stalk material, while the creature's thorax is made up of a ring of the fungus. It has a keen awareness of external stimuli, particularly living beings. A mouse in a cage was placed inside its cell for 1 hour. Unlike all of the humans exposed to SCP-5771 spores, the mouse did not die or suffer any form of fungal infection. What was more notable, however, was 5771's response to the mouse. Leaning in as close as it could, it appeared to stare at the mouse for the entire time that the mouse was in its cell, despite lacking eyes or any obvious sensory organs. Researchers noted an apparent air of curiosity about the tiny creature, or at the very least, a primitive interest. 5771 emits spores continuously. When it moved into its holding cell, the room filled with so many spores over the course of the week that it was difficult to even observe the creature through the cameras. It was determined that the cell would have to be cleaned twice a week. To ascertain how safe this would be, D-2304 was sent into the cell in a Level 2 hazmat suit. Within 3 minutes, the D-Class personnel was dead. It was decided that Level 4 hazmat suits were required, and since then, there have been no issues with infections of personnel from the spores. This is where Dr. Zaretsky came in. A keen mycologist with a background in studying the cordyceps genus, she had leaped at the opportunity to study SCP-5771. A particular breakthrough came when communication was established with the Mushroom Man. Dr. Zaretsky had the idea of using biodata sonification to try to look for any microcurrent fluctuations in SCP-5771, the same ones that occur in non-anomalous living organisms. To her and the research team's surprise, as soon as the electrodes were inserted into the SCP's feet, a low, slow voice seemed to appear in the static noise of the computers.
Nature is friend. Nature is friend. Why?
Enthused by her breakthrough, Dr. Zaretsky set up an interview slot as soon as possible to talk to 5771. It appeared to have a limited vocabulary, but did not display any significant difficulties in understanding her. When asked where it came from, 5771 simply replied,
Nature.
When asked for further specifics, it was only able to add that it came from
Mother.
Keen to understand what its purpose was, Dr. Zaretsky changed tack, asking the mushroom giant why it had been born. Why was it here? What did it want? On the surface, it appeared to ignore the question, choosing to ask one of its own.
Why hurt Mother?
Taken slightly aback by this, the doctor tried to clarify what it meant by them hurting Mother. the creature was not referring to her specifically, but to humanity collectively. It appeared to use the words mother and nature fairly interchangeably, so Dr. Zaretsky asked if it was referring to climate change. 5771 seemed to confirm that, informing her that mother was hurting, asking why humans wanted to hurt mother. Taking the offensive, Zaretsky asked 5771 why it had hurt and killed so many people, to which it simply said,
"Unintentional apologies."
It was then ascertained that the creature had no conscious control over the release of its deadly spores. Later assessment had also theorized that 5771 does not bend down towards humans as an attack to expose them to more spores, but is instead trying to make itself less intimidating. It spent much of the rest of the interview asking Dr. Zaretsky for forgiveness for its actions. The SCP seemed very keen to let her and the other researchers know that it never meant to hurt anybody, and even demonstrated remorse over its actions. In an attempt to reassure the SCP, who seemed to be growing more distressed by the minute, Zaretsky accepted the apology and said that they were friends. While it is difficult to tell if a mushroom is joyful, researchers generally agreed that it was the displayed emotion at hearing those words. And perhaps that was Dr. Zaretsky's big mistake. 5771, so happy to have made a friend, attempted to pick her up. Wrapping its fungal fingers around her torso, it lifted her straight off her feet and up into the air. Zaretsky screamed, taken aback completely and overcome with the fear of suffering the same fate as the 18 civilians in the national park. Realizing its mistake, the SCP dropped her from a height of 5 meters. She was rushed to the hospital with a broken left wrist, fractures in her left ankle, left arm, and left elbow, and some other minor sprain injuries. Out of action for 2 months, Dr. Zaretsky had no contact with the SCP as she lay in her hospital bed. Meanwhile, 5771 grew withdrawn. It would hunker down in the corner of its cell in an attempt to be as unthreatening as possible. Equipped with a proximity alarm, Dr. Danielle Baker took over the interview sessions. Asking sharp, direct questions, Dr. Baker tried to understand why SCP-5771 had attacked her colleague. The Mushroom Man, still crouched in the corner, apologized profusely. It referred to Zaretsky as friend, and repeatedly asked where she was with growing distress. Dr. Baker's interview technique in this session led her to be reprimanded by her supervisor. She pushed the questions hard, interrogating the creature as to why it had hurt the doctor. It was only when her supervisor stepped in that she relented, revealing that Zaretsky was alive and recovering well. As the interview concluded, 5771 had one request for the departing doctor:
Protect friend.
Fortunately, none of Dr. Zaretsky's injuries were serious. Within a few weeks, she was back in the cell with 5771, conducting another interview session. She barely entered the room and started to talk before the SCP interrupted her with cries of
Friend!
And many sincerely offered apologies for what it had done to her. The pair of them have conducted several interview sessions since, many of which have been left undocumented, as they contain little relevant data to help the Foundation understand this SCP or the wider world. Much of Zaretsky's conversations with the creature revolve around Mother. No matter Zaretsky's best efforts, 5771 seems unable to grasp why humans are hurting Mother. It uses the words burned, drowned, poisoned, and tortured to describe what is happening to Mother. It claims that this is the reason that it was created. Discussions between Dr. Zaretsky and her wider research team have concluded that SCP-5771 seems to have been created as a response to the climate crisis. Several have noted that the Gaia theory as a part of this finding, which claims that Earth is essentially one giant self-regulating organism called Gaia. Humans, plants, and animals all play roles equivalent to individual cells. If one group overpopulates and begins to harm Gaia, then the body as a whole takes steps to address the disturbance. SCP-5771 is theorized to be one of those steps being taken by Gaia, Mother Earth, Nature, or whichever title you prefer, in order to address the problem of man-made climate change. With the ability to empathize, communicate, and forgive, 5771 seems to be socially capable of encouraging behavioral changes in humans. Others have pointed out, much to Dr. Zaretsky's disdain, that 5771 is also highly lethal to humans, perhaps as a contingency measure to control population growth. Regardless, the Mushroom Man is to be kept within Foundation containment indefinitely. Interview sessions are ongoing, but it seems unlikely that this SCP could ever be in nature again, no matter how much Dr. Zaretsky advocates for it. Now go check out SCP-2800 Cactus Man and SCP-504 Bad Joke Tomatoes for more.